Chapter 4 of War Stories for My Grandchildren. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chris Hawkins. War Stories for My Grandchildren by John Watson Foster. Section 6. The Battle of Shiloh, Part 2. After finishing the foregoing letter, I wrote a short one to my wife. My own dear wife, your husband is still safe and unharmed, though he has passed through a most terrible and deathful battle, the bloodiest ever fought on the continent. While it was terrible, it was grand. I have just written a long letter to Father, which is for you all. I would write you at length, but is now past midnight, and after 2 days of hard fighting and one rainy night of gloomy and fearful watching, I need rest. You will excuse me, will you not? My dear Park, God, our merciful Father, has been my shield and my protector. Let us give him all the glory. Captain Dudley Smith, a relative of my wife, is badly, not mortally, wounded. His regiment fought next to us, and I shook hands of encouragement with him not 5 minutes before he fell. Both his lieutenants and first sergeant were shot. I believe, my dear, that God will continue to preserve my life for you and my dear child. Live in hope and faith. I will write a long letter soon. In the letter to my father given above, I refer in commendation to my brother Alexander H. Foster, the regimental quartermaster. He rendered a most valuable service in saving all our camp and personal baggage. When during the first day's fighting it became evident that the battle was going against us, he brought up the wagons and loaded up all the company and headquarters baggage and outfit, and took them to the rear. The rebels occupied our tents on Sunday night, and would have plundered everything but for our quartermaster's thoughtfulness. He also displayed great daring in keeping us supplied with ammunition during the first day's heavy fighting. Another incident respecting our tents may be noted. When attending the Harvard Law School, I had formed a very close friendship with a classmate from Alabama, Walter Bragg. I corresponded with him for some time, but lost sight of him when the war began. Years after, he came to Washington to fill an important position. I learned from him that on Sunday night of the Shiloh battle, his regiment occupied the camp of the 25th Indiana, and he slept in our headquarters tent. General Grant, in his personal memoir, says, "The Battle of Shiloh was the severest battle fought at the West during the war, and but a few in the East equaled it for hard, determined fighting." General Sherman, in his memoirs, characterized it as one of the most fiercely contested of the war. The number of Confederate forces engaged in the battle, as reported by Beauregard, was 40,955. Grant reports the Federal forces in the first day fighting at 33,000, and that on the second day he was reinforced by General Lew Wallace with 5,000, and from Buell's army with 20,000. The losses of the Federals were killed 1,754, wounded 8,408, missing 2,934. The Confederate losses were killed 1,728, wounded 8,012, and missing 957. In my official report, I placed the loss of the 25th Indiana at 149. While the battle was recognized as a distinct Union victory, it was followed in the North by severe criticism of generalship displayed on the Federal side. Sherman says that probably no single battle of the war gave rise to such wild and damaging reports, and in his memoirs, Grant writes, "The Battle of Shiloh or Pittsburgh Landing has been perhaps less understood, or to state the case more accurately, more persistently misunderstood than any other engagement during the entire rebellion." The main criticisms were 3 in number. First, that no entrenchments or fortifications of any kind were made to protect the encampment. Second, that our army was surprised. And third, that the retreating enemy was not pursued. It is generally conceded that the encampment was well located for defense, as 3 sides were protected by the river and creeks full of water. Sherman, in discussing the first criticism in later years, said, "The position was naturally strong. We could have rendered this position impregnable in one night." General Force, in reviewing the battle after the close of the war, wrote, "The army had many things to learn, and the use of field fortifications was one of them." The charge that our camp was surprised was indignantly denied by both Generals Grant and Sherman, and they produce statements of fact, not generally understood at the time, which seems to sustain their contention. But a different impression was generally prevalent in the camp. One of the most intelligent and daring of the Civil War correspondents was a young man writing under the nom de plume of Agate, who became afterwards well known throughout the world, Whitelaw Reid. He was on the battlefield during the 2 days' fighting and wrote lengthy reports of the battle. His contention was that it was a complete surprise. Years afterwards, he had a discussion on this matter with General Sherman, and in the course of it he cited my letter to my father, above quoted, to sustain his contention. Doubtless the rebel army would have been much more demoralized and have sustained great loss in military equipment and supplies if it had been vigorously pursued. The greater part of Grant's army was so reduced and fatigued as not to be able to make an effective pursuit of the retreating Confederates, but Buell's army was not in that condition. Publications made after the war by Grant and Buell make it plain that there was want of harmony, if not an unfriendly spirit, that prevented the cordial cooperation which might have made the battle much more decisive. For some months previous to the Battle of Shiloh, General Halleck had been commanding the Department of the West, with his headquarters at St. Louis, from which place he was directing the movements of the armies. Immediately after this battle he came to Pittsburgh Landing, arriving on April 11, and assuming personal command. He began the reorganization and reinforcement of the army in the vicinity for a march on Corinth, where it was understood the Confederates were concentrating. This step on his part had the effect of practically relieving General Grant from command. The news of the battle and heavy losses suffered by the Union forces awakened through the country great interest and sympathy, and from all the cities of the West located on the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, steamers were chartered and dispatched to the battlefield, loaded with hospital supplies, volunteer surgeons, and friends of the soldiers. A boat was sent to Evansville, and among the passengers was my brother George, bringing letters from home and delicacies for the wounded soldiers of the 25th and our mess. In a letter of the 11th, 4 days after the battle, I wrote to my wife, "I can assure you I was glad to see the Bowen with a load of our kind friends after a terrible experience of the last week, and to know that the great patriotic heart of the nation was going out in sympathy and in the acts of mercy to our suffering wounded, who have been so sadly, cruelly neglected by our Army General Medical Officers. I thank you and Eliza and Eleanor, my sisters, and our good friends at home for their presence. In our hard-fought battle of last Sunday, the enemy drove us back clear behind our camp and rascally carried off or devoured all of our eatables, and your delicacies came just in time to be fully appreciated. I haven't seen Captain Smith since he was wounded. I suppose he has gone down the river in the boats. You remember I wrote you we were on a court-martial together. I was finally excused from it to take command of our regiment. I saw Colonel Harlan, afterwards Justice of the United States Supreme Court, married Miss Shanklin of Evansville today. He was in good health. His regiment is lying near us, in the woods without tents. I meet a large number of acquaintances in the Indiana regiments of Buell's army. I send by George a copy of my official report of the 25th. Tell Father I cannot have it published yet, but I thought he and our home folks would want to read it, but don't circulate it too freely. As soon as I get the necessary consent, I will have both Colonel Veach's brigade and my regimental report sent home for publication. I am anxious that our regiment should have a fair share of the honor, as it had of the fighting. Say to Father and our friends that our regiment fought bravely and did itself and the state credit. I had the entire responsibility of the command. I believe I did my duty well. All assure me of it in the highest terms. I know I saved the regiment from disgrace and annihilation by a little daring exposure and vigorous encouragement of our men. This I write freely, but privately to you and Father. It is a great consolation to me as a citizen to know I have done my duty, but it is a further gratification to know that my friends at home give me credit for it. On the 13th I write about the return of the steamer Bowen to Evansville. It was much out of humor because they let the boat be filled up with slightly wounded of other regiments, and left 30 or 40 of our badly wounded 25th in the hospitals at Savannah, to linger and suffer from neglect and bad treatment, and run the chance of getting home on the charity of other parts of the state. But I suppose the committee in charge did what they thought was best. Still, we are naturally sensitive and jealous for the comfort of our own men. In my letter of the 13th, I speak of the difficulty of getting my letters. Officers and men of the regiment were constantly going and coming from Evansville on furlough or sick leave, and they were often availed of to carry mail matter, as the mail was not regular. But I note one instance in which my letters by private hand did not reach me for 30 days. I tell my wife, when you can't have opportunities of sending letters to me by private means, send them by mail. They will get here after a while, and they are never old. Your letter of Sunday was 7 days in coming. I have just received your 3 letters sent by Schoenfield. They were a little behind time, being dated March 14, but they were still very welcome. I received by him the Evangelist and Independent. I always like to get them, especially the Evangelist, as it gives a little variety to my religious reading. Colonel Morgan's father arrived in camp today, expecting to find the colonel nearly dead, and found he'd gone home only slightly wounded. These newspaper reporters ought to be severely punished for their wicked and foolish exaggerations. The idea of reporting 20,000 of our troops and 40,000 of the rebels killed and wounded serves only to fearfully excite the country, and is so very grossly absurd. It was a terrible fight, but not such as was reported in the first dispatches. These reporters see but little of the fight, hear a great deal, and tell all they hear and a great deal more. I have nothing new to write, but thought you would love to hear after this terrible battle. Be cheerful, hopeful, and patriotic. My letter of the 15th was in the most desponding tone since I had entered the service. It must be confessed it presented a sorry picture of the 1,046 stalwart men who left Evansville 8 months before the war. I enclosed you an extract from a communication addressed to our brigade commander. You will see from it that our regiment is pretty well used up, between sickness and the bullets of the enemy, having suffered more than any other regiment from Indiana in battle. In this condition of affairs, I feel constrained to ask that the regiment be somewhat relieved. Alec has been troubled with camp dysentery, and wants to resign soon, but I have been doing all I can to keep him up and in good spirits, and to stay with us. Colonel James C. Veatch, commanding 2nd Brigade, 4th Division. Sir, permit me to call your attention to the present conditions of the 25th Regiment, Indiana Volunteers. In the late action of Fort Donelson, we sustained a loss in killed and wounded of 115, and in the late battle of Pittsburgh Landing of 149, making a total of 264. A number of the wounded have since died. A large number are entirely disabled for any military duty, and nearly all the wounded will be unfit for duty for some time. There are now absent from the regiment, sick 309 enlisted men, and sick in the regiment 130, making a total sick of 439. I am left in the sole command of the regiment, the lieutenant colonel being wounded and the adjutant having resigned. 3 of our most efficient officers were killed in the late action, and 6 of them severely wounded and disabled. 2 of our captains absent, 1 of them badly wounded at Fort Donelson, the other sick. 3 other of our captains broken down with continuous sickness and hard service, and are asking that they may be relieved or resign. We now report only 387 men for duty. Under date of the 18th I write, it is now nearly 2 weeks since the battle, and our camp is again resuming its quiet and accustomed ways, as if no terrible conflict had taken place over these grounds. All our wounded are gone, and are now in the hospitals at home. I hope they will be well cared for, as I am sure they will be. We don't know how long we will stay here, or what are the intentions of the generals, but I think we shall remain for at least 10 days. General Halleck will hardly move till he has his army so disposed as to make victory certain. He says, so it is reported, that enough lives have been lost here, and that he will accomplish the rest without much fighting. I suppose you all hope this will be the case. General Hurlbut says he will not take his division into the next battle, if he can prevent it, owing to its heavy losses in the late battle. In our regiment and the brigade, every 3rd man was either killed or wounded, so you may rest in considerable quiet, as I think the probabilities of us having much fighting is very remote. But if it becomes necessary and we are called upon, we will do our duty. You would want us to do nothing less. I never expect to witness such another battle in my life. It was terrible and grand. I could not describe it. It is only to be seen and heard. I had no conception of what battle was before. The Fort Donelson fight was a mere skirmish by the side of it. You will preserve all things of interest in the papers, especially relating to their regiment in the battle. But there were so many regiments in the fight, we do not expect to get much notice, especially as we have no reporters in our employ. I trust, my dear Park, you will have confidence in my continued safety and health, wishing for a happy termination of our troubles and my speedy return, remembering that I will not expose myself or our regiment more than is essential to our duty, safety, and honor. I send many kisses to my darling little daughter. My letter of the 20th acknowledges the receipt of the first letter from my wife after the Battle of Shiloh. You cannot know how glad I was to receive your letter of the 12th. I have read it over many, many times during the last 2 hours since I received it. When I read your letter and knew with what feelings of joy you learned of my safety, I could not keep back my tears. I have something to live for and something to encourage me to do my duty bravely, when I am assured of so dear and loving a wife and such good relatives and friends. I was very anxious to hear from you after the battle, and this was the first letter. I knew there would be great anxiety at home, both for myself and the regiment, so I sent full particulars and a list of the killed and wounded by the first opportunity. I have already given a copy of the letter I wrote my father the night after the second day's fighting. Although I cautioned him that it was only for the family and not for the public, he was so much pleased with and proud of it he let the newspaper men take a copy of it. The New York Tribune, in publishing it on April 22, headed it with this comment: "The following account of the great battle, written by Major John W. Foster, of the 25th Indiana, is the most clear relation we have yet met with. In my letter to my wife of the 20th, I make this comment: I was very sorry to see my letter to father in the newspapers. I did not want it published. I so stated to him. I don't want to blow my own trumpet. If the people at home can't learn of my exploits in some other way, it is better they should not hear them at all. Don't publish any more of my letters unless I give my consent." But other accounts than mine were published. I make an extract from one of them written the day after the battle. The 25th has gained fresh renown, and can point to their thin ranks as the record of their part in the dreadful day. Colonel Veatch had 2 horses shot under him while commanding the brigade. Lieutenant Colonel Morgan was wounded in the first fierce charge that brought down so many of his men. Major Foster was everywhere in the thickest of the fight, leading the charge or directing the backward movement. The men will follow those officers anywhere, and Indiana may justly be proud of them. In my letter of the 20th, I report a proposed movement of our camp. Our old camp becoming unpleasant after the great slaughter of men and animals in the battle, we have been ordered to a new camp 4 miles nearer the enemy. We made our preparations, but a heavy rain has delayed. I think when Colonel Morgan rejoins the regiment, after we have whipped the rebels at Corinth and our men have a prospect of a little rest, I will have to manage to get sick, and by this means get a sick leave of a month, and come home to see my little daughter, to keep her from growing entirely out of my knowledge, and to enjoy the long-desired society of my dear wife and friends. But I won't set my heart upon it, neither must you, for the probabilities are we will have to finish up this rebellion before any of us can get home. Then I will come and make a lifelong visit with you, for it will take a very loud and patriotic call from my country to make me leave my family again. In my letter of the 21st, I note an event which led to an important change in my military service. My wife had 2 brothers younger than herself, Theodore, a student in the senior class at the State University, and Alexander, then a clerk in the post office at Evansville. When the war broke out, Alexander, or Zan, was very anxious to enlist, but he was only 16 years old, and we refused our consent largely on account of his youth, and besides, as I was about to enter the service. I wanted him to stay home to look after my wife and their mother, but after the successive victories at Donelson and Shiloh, and he heard from the returned soldiers about me, he became restless to join our regiment. I refer to him in my letter of the 25th. I sent Zan a telegram and also wrote him a letter yesterday, saying if Theodore could take his place in the post office, I would have him made a lieutenant and assign him to duty as regimental commissary. But I do not want you to be left at home without one of the boys with you while I'm away, and he is not to come without the approval of father and his mother. Another reason which has caused me to decide for him to come, on the above conditions, was that Alec, my brother, has been a little unwell for some weeks, is getting tired, insists on going out of the service, and says he has only stayed on my account. He says if Zan comes, he can act as commissary, and he, Alec, will stay a month until Zan gets posted in the business, and we can have him appointed regimental quartermaster. If Alec goes home, as he seems determined to do, I would like to have Zan with me, as I don't fancy being here alone. End of section 6.
Chapter 5 of War Stories for My Grandchildren. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Painter. War Stories for My Grandchildren by John Watson Foster. Chapter 5. On to Corinth and Memphis. Evidently General Halleck's efforts to reorganize the army after the Battle of Shiloh were having a salutary effect in the camp, as indicated in my letter of the 21st of April. We are having greater confidence in the army now. We think Halleck will manage affairs with much system and skill, and will not cause such needless slaughter of brave soldiers as we had on the 6th. I am glad to see the public journals exposing the wretched generalship which permitted a complete surprise of a large army and its almost complete annihilation. But matters will go on much better now. System is beginning to be apparent in every department, and care and foresight. If we only had a good full regiment, everything would go well with me, but we are sadly cut up. Sickness has weakened us very much, and the last 2 battles have seriously reduced us. Our officers from sickness, exposure, and other causes are resigning. 2 of them go home tomorrow. My own health and spirits are very good, but it is a little discouraging to see the regiment so weakened. But I cannot end the extracts without a little glimpse at our home life, for which I so often express a longing in my letters. The Mr. Tubbs referred to was the bearer of my wife's letter. Mr. Tubbs said he called on you before he left and heard you play and praised your music extravagantly. I hope you do not neglect your practice, as I want you always to be able to play as well as when we were married. He spoke of what a pleasant home I had. It made me want to be there. I was much moved at Father's last letter, in which he said I was always in the thoughts of the folks at home, that the little ones talked about me every day. How I wish I could be at home with them again to enjoy the company of the little ones, of my own Alice and the rest. After 3 weeks of waiting, recuperation and reinforcement, General Halleck began the movement of his grand army against Corinth in the last days of April. General Grant places its number at 120,000. I reported this movement in my letter of May the 3rd as having already begun, and in anticipation of another battle, I seek to quiet my wife's fears. I wrote you of our change of camp, going 4 miles away from the river beyond Shiloh Church toward Corinth, and we are now under orders to proceed to Monterey, 5 miles from this camp, so that tomorrow night we hope to be 13 or 14 miles from the river and 5 or 6 miles from Corinth. But I think we shall not have a great battle for some days yet, for I think the enemy will wait for us to attack them in their entrenchments. You must not be too solicitous if you hear of a great battle, or be too credulous of telegraphic reports. I will try to do my duty, and we will leave the result to our Heavenly Father, who has kindly been my shield and protector thus far through terrible dangers. On the 7th of May I write, "We are all packed up in camp under marching orders to go 2 miles farther to the front, and are quietly waiting for the orders to move. So while we are waiting, I will try to pencil you a little note at least." For the first time since I entered the army, with the exception of temporary colds, I report a slight illness. I have been a little unwell for 2 or 3 days past, but we are having very pleasant weather today, and I shall soon be well again. I cannot afford to be sick at this time. I must wait at least till we get the enemy out of Corinth, or wherever we meet them. I see by the papers that the reporters have got the enemy out of Corinth. It may be so, but we don't know it here. May 8, I note the arrival at the camp of Alexander Macpherson. Zan arrived at the river night before last, but did not get out here till this morning. I sent a recommendation to Governor Morton this morning for his appointment, and he will go at once to work. We are now 14 miles from Pittsburgh Landing and 6 miles from Corinth. We are getting forward gradually. Moved 1 mile to the front yesterday. The letter of May 12 says, "We have been moving out slowly and by degrees from Pittsburgh. We are now about 18 miles from the river and 6 miles from Corinth. Our pickets are within 3 or 4 miles of Corinth and can hear very plainly the locomotives whistle and the drums beat. We have various rumours of its evacuation, but can tell nothing of their truth. I think the enemy are still there. I have come very near being quite ill for the last few days with fever, but fortunately have escaped and am nearly well again. We were called out in line of battle the other day by a false alarm, and I thought I must go out with my men, though I had a high fever, and standing out in the hot sun for 2 hours, and we have hot sun now, nearly laid me up permanently. It is the nearest I have come to being real sick since I have been in the service, but I am pretty well over it now, thanks to my strong resolution and Dr. Walker's good treatment. Dr. Walker says I have barely escaped typhoid fever. I have taken medicine quite freely. I cannot afford to be sick now. The enemy must first be driven out of Corinth." On the 16th I write, "We move up slowly, and as we go we fortify our camps by a continuous line of breastwork of logs, brush, and earthwork. The newspaper reporters have kept you unnecessarily alarmed about the battle, which could not be delayed a day longer, and yet it has been delayed for a month. When it is to come off I do not know, or whether it is at all. We have for more than a week past been right in the face of the enemy's pickets, the men of our regiment fighting them all the time, and whenever it becomes necessary for us to move our camp forward, our pickets make a push on them and drive them back the required distance, rather obstinately, however. The pickets are now about a mile in advance, and almost any time we can hear the rifles crack, and frequently they go by volleys. If the enemy are going to fight, we can't go much further. Zan is in good health and doing well. He is the most anxious man in the regiment for a fight." In a previous letter I noted that Colonel Veatch had received his commission as Brigadier General, and that Governor Morton was on a visit to the camps, and we might expect our promotion soon. I had also reported Governor Morton's visit to Fort Donelson after the battle there. He was one of the most distinguished civilians which the Civil War brought into public notice, and was especially esteemed for his services toward the soldiers. Many years after the war, one of our presidents, in a public address, said, "When history definitely awards the credit for what was done in the Civil War, she will put the service of no other civilian, save alone those of Lincoln, ahead of the services of Governor Morton." I reported May 19. Governor Morton visited us yesterday and was warmly received by the boys. He told them he would make Lieutenant Colonel Morgan colonel and me lieutenant colonel for our services in the field, and the captains have voted for Captain Rhinelander for major. I will get my commission today, and so you can address me as Lieutenant Colonel Foster hereafter, and call me colonel, not major. We are called out into line of battle now every morning at daylight, and some mornings we are out in line by 3 o'clock. Thus, you see, we are determined not to be surprised again by the enemy if early rising is to have anything to do with it. So I am writing my letter to you before sunrise. A short letter on the 22nd says, "I write you this note to say I will write you a long letter tomorrow, to assure you of my increasing health and strength, and to let you know we are still out of a battle. Since Captain Rhinelander has been made major, I can be relieved of a portion of the outside heavy work and have the responsibility of the command divided. If Colonel Morgan was back again, I could take things comparatively easy." In the letter of the 23rd, it is stated that the St. Louis, Chicago, and Cincinnati papers are now regularly on sale by newsboys, showing that the communication with the rear was well maintained. But I still want the Evansville papers, the magazines, and the Evangelist. I go more into detail in the method of our advances. We are slowly and safely approaching Corinth, making our way secure as we go. We have a heavy skirmish with the enemy's pickets. If they are obstinate, we get out the artillery, throw a few shells into the woods, drive them back over a ridge into a hollow a half-mile or so, then leave our camp equipage behind and march out with guns, knapsacks, haversacks, spades, axes, and picks in hand, and throw up breastworks on the ridge. When that is done, we move up our camp equipage and remain in camp here for a day or more. Then we shove up the enemy's pickets again and make another camp, and thus we are approaching the enemy's works. Our generals, I believe, are going to consult the lives of the soldiers in winning the next battle. Though most of the people in the States seem anxious that the fight should come off in a hurry. If they had to do the fighting, it might be different. If Beauregard will really stand, he will surely be defeated, though it may cost the lives of many brave soldiers. But the life of any of us is nothing in comparison with the life and safety of the nation. If it were not so, I would not risk my life in the contest. Under date of May 29, I allude to a forward movement of the 25th Indiana, similar to others previously made, but which, unknown to us at the time, was a general advance of Sherman and Hurlbut's divisions, and proved to be the last military demonstration against Corinth, as the enemy was then engaged in the evacuation of the place. We went forward yesterday with our brigade and drove the enemy back a mile, thus getting room for a new camp. Tomorrow we will all move up another mile, getting close neighbours with Corinth. We were all glad to welcome Colonel Morgan back today, and I have been busy talking regimental matters with him. The paymaster has been with us today, and I am sending you $600. I want you to be at perfect liberty in using the money. Make your house and family comfortable, live well, and enjoy yourself. Consult father about the rent of the house, respecting which you wrote me. Don't let these business affairs worry you. Take the world easy. At last the grand march on the rebel stronghold of Corinth was over. My letter of June 1 says, "I suppose there was at least one anxious heart relieved by the news which ought to have reached home yesterday, that the rebels have evacuated Corinth and concluded not to give us battle. So you and the thousands of wives and relatives of our soldiers can rest quiet for some time. After the long preparations and constant and watchful readiness we had maintained for battle, it was and is now a great relief for us to relax and take some comfort. For weeks men have been sleeping with all their accoutrements on and their arms by their sides, and were ordered out in line of battle sometimes at midnight or any other hour, but always at early daylight. It is a great relief to us all to lie down quietly now and sleep without being disturbed by the long roll or hasty orders from the generals. I've enjoyed the luxury of the good morning naps, waiting for the rays of the sun to waken me. Until last night I have slept with all my clothes on and in utmost readiness for a prompt turnout. I am thankful for good sleep now, and you are thankful that we had no battle. None of our regiment has been killed, but several were wounded on picket and in the recent skirmishes. I have passed through several narrow escapes, but then a miss is as good as a mile. In the last skirmish 3 days ago, Dr. Walker and I were talking together, on horseback, discussing the close range the enemy had upon us with their cannon, while the shot would occasionally rattle through the trees. when an unwelcome visitor in the shape of a shell came whizzing along and went into the ground right between our horses, tearing up the dirt at a fearful rate. The boys dug it out, and it was found that the rebels in their hurry had forgot to gouge the fuse, and fortunately it did not explode. I rode into Corinth yesterday. The fearful ravages of war are visible on all sides, in the charred walls, solitary chimneys, smoking ruins, and waste all around. The rebels burned all their storehouses full of supplies, their magazines, armouries, etc. In peaceful times the town was a very attractive place. General Hurlbut is said to be anxious to get the position of commandant of Memphis and to march our division over immediately and occupy. It is uncertain whether he will succeed. My health, also Zan's, is good now. The escape of the Confederate army from Corinth and the subsequent breaking up of Halleck's great army was a disappointment to the people of the North. Halleck's generalship had been severely criticised by both Grant and Sherman in their memoirs. Grant describes the movement upon Corinth as a siege from the start to the close, and says, "I am satisfied that Corinth could have been captured in a 2 days' campaign commenced promptly on the arrival of reinforcements after the Battle of Shiloh." Sherman laments that the advance on Corinth had occupied all of the month of May, the most beautiful and valuable month of the year for campaigning in this latitude. And he adds that, "By the time we had reached Corinth, I believe that army was the best then on this continent and could have gone where it pleased." While Buell's army was sent toward the east, Sherman and Hurlbut were sent west toward Memphis. Our regiment was destined to have no rest, as the day after we entered Corinth, June 1, we received orders to support Sherman's division, which had gone forward on the Memphis and Charleston Railroad toward Memphis. In half an hour we were in line of march, with 2 days' rations and no tents. We had a heavy rain that evening. The men marched 2 hours into the night, and then lay right down by the roadside on the wet ground and slept till morning. In the morning we went to work cleaning out and chopping the fallen timber from the railroad, and then went into camp. And here we are now, 5 miles out west from Corinth. Our camp baggage was not all up for 5 days. We have a very pleasant camp in a shady forest, everything to make us comfortable in camp but the wood ticks, which are multitudinous, pestiferous, and unescapable. They have almost worried the life out of me by their biting. This country abounds in snakes, lizards, and all kinds of troublesome insects. I have taken a few rides out into the neighbouring country, and find it tolerably well settled, but the soil is very poor, the people likewise, and very ignorant. Since we have been in this camp, we have managed to get for our mess fresh milk, young chicken, eggs, green peas, onions, and lettuce, which are great luxuries with us, who had had nothing but government supplies and what we could get from the settlers. We find very little bitter feeling or hostility exhibited toward us by the country people, and all willing and longing for peace. But the men are almost all gone, either in the army or afraid to trust us. They who did not volunteer have been forced into the rebel service by the conscription system, until there are hardly enough left to gather the wheat, which is now ready for harvesting. The farmhouses were full of women and children. They have no money but Confederate scrip and shin plasters. How it makes their eyes sparkle to see our soldiers' silver and gold. But what is more desired by them than silver and gold is coffee. It very often happens that we are utterly unable to get their consent to sell one of the few remaining chickens on the farm with silver at high prices, but a pound of coffee will get the last old hen on the place. We don't certainly know what is to be our future destination, but it is semi-officially stated in camp that W.T. Sherman's and Hurlbut's divisions are to constitute the branch of the army which is to move on Memphis. We are anxious to go to that place, but our wish has nothing to do with it, as we are government soldiers to be disposed of as our generals think best. There, you see, I have filled up the sheet with a matter-of-fact, business-like letter without assuring you how much I long to be with you and at home. But I don't allow myself to think too much of these things, or I would get homesick. I long with you for the war to end, that I may lay aside my emblems of the army and return to my dear wife and child, and the comforts and enjoyments of civil life. But I must be patient. Some days later, an undated letter says, "I had thought of writing you a good long letter this morning, but all human hopes are vain. This morning we have marching orders for the West, and there is no time for letter writing. We are not informed as to our destination, but the general impression among the officers is that we are bound for Memphis. Will you come down and see me there, or shall I jump on a boat and come up the Mississippi and Ohio and see you?" My next letter was written from Grand Junction, a station on the Memphis and Charleston Railroad, midway from Corinth to Memphis. The marching orders mentioned in the preceding letter were for Memphis, but on reaching this station our regiment was diverted from its course, as will be seen from the letter of June 20. "We arrived here 5 days ago, but our brigade was sent on an expedition down to Holly Springs, 30 miles south in Mississippi, to destroy the Mississippi Central Railroad, which took us till last night, the rest of the army remaining here to support us in case of danger. We came back all safe. The march was a very rapid but pleasant one, through a beautiful country and to one of the prettiest towns in the South. We hope to leave for Memphis tomorrow." This was the last letter written by me from the 25th Indiana. On my arrival at Grand Junction, I learned that Alexander McPherson, my wife's brother, was ill at Lagrange, a station on the railroad a short distance from Grand Junction. I at once hastened to his bedside, and found him suffering from a severe attack of typhoid fever, which was prevalent in the camps. Notwithstanding he received the most skilful medical attendance, the virulence of the disease soon placed him beyond human aid, and he died on June 27. I secured a furlough to take his body home. The regiment continued on its march to Memphis, and I went on my sad journey to Evansville, bringing the body of the young soldier to his bereaved mother and sister. The sequel shows that I never returned to the 25th Indiana, with which I had passed through so many dangers and privations, and with whose men I had formed the deep attachment of soldier comradeship. The following editorial in the Evansville Journal of July 2, 1862, reflects the sentiments of all who knew him. A telegram last night brought the melancholy news of the death of Lieutenant Alexander McPherson to his friends in this city. He died at Lagrange, Tennessee, on the 27th ult., at the age of 17. When he asked permission to join the army, he said that he felt it his duty to go into the service, that neither of his mother's sons were there, and he would never feel satisfied unless he did his share in putting down the rebellion. Less than 2 months ago he left his friends and home, buoyant in health, and with high hopes of a pleasant and useful career in the Grand Army of the Mississippi, having been appointed commissary to the 25th Indiana Volunteers. But how soon those hopes are blasted, how soon that health is destroyed by a fatal disease. In early youth he is cut off. Young McPherson was a generous, noble youth, warm-hearted and highly esteemed by the whole community, who will warmly sympathize with his bereaved friends in this hour of their affliction. End of chapter 5.
Chapter 6 of War Stories for My Grandchildren. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Robert Robinson. Chapter 6. When I arrived at Evansville in July 1863 on furlough, I found the border country on both sides of the Ohio River in Indiana and Kentucky in a state of feverish excitement. The counties of western Kentucky were overrun with Confederate soldiers, who had secretly and singly passed through the military lines, and were engaged actively in the work of securing recruits for the rebel army and, after mounting them on horses taken from loyal citizens, sent them back through the lines to the south. Guerrilla bands were roaming through these counties, terrorizing the Union men and threatening to cross the Ohio. In fact, about the time of my arrival at home, a small guerrilla force had occupied Newburgh, a town 9 miles above Evansville, and robbed the stores, striking terror into the inhabitants. As no regular forces were available for defense, Governor Morton had rushed several bodies of Home Guards to Evansville, and was organizing 30 and 60 days' men for service in various parts of Indiana, to serve until the federal government was able to protect the disturbed districts by regularly organized and armed troops. General Love, who had charge of these state forces with his headquarters in Evansville, requested me to take command of these irregular levies and occupy Henderson, the most important town in that section of Kentucky, 10 miles below Evansville on the Ohio River, as a base for operations against these marauding rebels. This I consented to do as a temporary expedient. On the 26th of July, a few days after we had occupied Henderson, Governor Morton repeated from Indianapolis a telegram from General J.T. Boyle at Louisville, commanding the United States military forces in Kentucky, as follows: "Give the order to Lieutenant Colonel Foster in my name to command at Henderson." As my furlough from the 25th Indiana was about to expire, and neither Governor Morton nor General Boyle would listen to my intimation that I would have to rejoin my regiment, estimating highly the value of my military experience in the absence of other available officers, the governor secured from General Grant an order detaching me temporarily from the 25th Indiana, and authorizing me to continue in the service in Kentucky. I was clothed by General Boyle with the most drastic authority to put an end to the troubles in western Kentucky. The order above quoted, by which I was placed in command at Henderson, contained also the following instructions: "Order the officers in my name to kill every armed rebel offering resistance, and all banded as guerrillas. I want none such as prisoners. Order them to disarm every disloyal man." Only a few days after I was put in command by General Boyle, August 2, he sent the following telegram: "If officers and men do not obey my orders to shoot down the armed rebels, every bushwhacker, guerrilla, or banded villains, our forces had better be withdrawn from the field. We can only save the state by putting them to the sword. I want none of them as prisoners. Take no oath or bonds. You will shoot down the scoundrels." These and other orders from him of like character, which I quote, will indicate the bitter spirit which prevailed at the time in Kentucky between the loyal and disloyal citizens. General Boyle was a native-born citizen of Kentucky. Immediately after I assumed command at Henderson, I set to work to get the irregular and inexperienced forces collected there into such organized shape as would enable me to go out into the country to attack and drive out the rebel bands which were infesting that region. While engaged in that work, I was embarrassed by a civil duty which I had to face. A short time before my arrival, an election had been held in Kentucky for city, county, and other officials. General Boyle had issued an order regulating the election to this effect: "No person hostile in opinion to the government will be allowed to stand for office in Kentucky. The attempt of such a person to stand for office will be regarded as in itself sufficient evidence of his treasonable intent to warrant his arrest. In seeking office, he becomes an active traitor, if he does not become one otherwise, and is liable both in reason and in law to be treated accordingly. All persons of this description in offering themselves as candidates for office will be arrested and sent to these headquarters." The election at Henderson had resulted in the choice of a mayor and city council, all of whom were sympathizers with the rebellion. On my arrival, the mayor fled from the city. I telegraphed General Boyle. The mayor of this city has left town without leave. Been absent a week. Strongly suspected of being among the guerrillas. The city council are secessionists in sympathy. Have you any action to direct?" He replied, "When mayor returns, arrest him. If you deem proper, arrest any of the council and send all to Camp Morton. The men elected to office in Hopkins County I wish taken and sent in with the others. Leniency or conciliation do no good. The scoundrels must be subjugated or killed." It was soon established that the mayor had fled through the lines and joined the Confederate forces, whereupon I summoned a meeting of the council and requested them to declare the office of mayor vacant, and each of them to take the oath of loyalty exacted of suspected citizens. Rather than take this action, all the members of the council resigned. The city marshal likewise refused to take the oath of loyalty, and I declared his office vacant. This left the city without any civil government. I therefore issued a proclamation as military commander of the post, assuming control of civil affairs, quote, "until the loyal citizens shall have filled the offices with loyal men," end quote, and order an election to be held on a day designated. Meanwhile, a citizen of Henderson was appointed by me provost marshal and furnished with a military guard to enforce order. My action in the matter was approved by my superior commanders. Thenceforth, during my command in western Kentucky, I had no trouble with the civil authorities of Henderson. Having gotten my forces in a fair condition for a campaign against the guerrilla bands, I was about to make an expedition into the adjoining counties, when I received a report that the Confederate trooper John Morgan, with a large force, was just across the line in Tennessee, and learned that one of his subordinates, Adam Johnson, a noted guerrilla chief, was already in my district. Before moving, I inquired of General Boyle as to Morgan's whereabouts, and he replied, "Morgan is near Gallatin. He cannot venture into your section. No danger from that source. Johnson is a great liar, as all rebels are. You can go where you please. Act on your own discretion. Shoot down the banded scoundrels as guerrillas or as recruits for the rebel army." I had received reliable information that a considerable band of armed and organized rebels were quartered at Madisonville, the county seat of Hopkins County, about 40 miles from Henderson, actively recruiting for their army and levying upon the loyal citizens for horses and supplies. With several companies of infantry and such a force of cavalry as I could get, a mere handful, I embarked at night on a steamer going up the Ohio and Green Rivers to within 3 miles of Madisonville, where we disembarked early in the morning and moved toward the town, hoping to surprise the enemy. But we found them posted in a forest, heavily wooded and thick with underbrush, in the suburbs of the town. I ordered forward our skirmishers, who engaged them with a brisk fire, but before our line of battle could reach them they fled precipitately, mounting their horses and scattering in every direction. The result of the skirmish was a few soldiers wounded and a number of the rebels as prisoners. We went into camp at Madisonville, and scouting parties were sent out in various directions. A few prisoners were brought in, but no banded rebels could be met with, as, being mounted on good horses and aided by resident sympathizers, they were able to get out of the way. During our stay, some of our soldiers on picket duty were shot down, murdered in the darkness of the night, by persons claiming to be Southern soldiers, skulking behind rocks and bushes. We were indignant at such warfare, and I issued a proclamation, which was scattered throughout the county, denouncing this irregular and barbarous warfare as contrary to the rules of civilized nations, declaring that the firing upon pickets, when no enemy was near, was cold-blooded murder, and giving notice that for every picket thereafter murdered, one of the captured guerrillas in our hands would be put to death as a felon. I never had occasion to put this threat into execution, and probably never would have done so, but the proclamation had its desired effect, and the killing of our pickets ceased. The expedition to Madisonville was heralded by the papers of Indiana as a great victory and magnified into a battle, but to me, who had so recently come from Fort Donaldson and Shiloh, it seemed a mere skirmish of slight proportions. I soon returned to the post at Henderson, leaving a small detachment at Madisonville to protect the loyal citizens from the depredations of the guerrillas. On my return, I found that a reign of terror existed in the adjoining county of Union, that the loyal officers recently elected were not permitted by the secessionists to act, that a returned Union soldier at home on furlough had been ambushed and murdered, and that unarmed steamers on the Ohio had been repeatedly fired on from Uniontown. Reporting these facts to General Boyle, I was authorized to levy on the secession sympathizers of the locality a fund for the support of the family of the murdered soldier. As to Uniontown, he telegraphed me, quote, "If the rebels take any town on the river and use it to fire on boats, you will burn or demolish it. It would be well to burn down Uniontown if it is likely to fall into the hands of the rebels." Unquote. I made an expedition into Union County with a view to overawe the rebel sympathizers and place the loyal officers recently elected in the exercise of their duties. But it proved to no avail. The guerrillas easily got out of our way, and the rebel residents denied all knowledge of them or of the parties guilty of the soldiers' murder. The loyal officers were unwilling to attempt to assume their duties unless I would agree to keep a force of soldiers permanently at the county seat, and this I could not do with my inadequate command. For the first month or 6 weeks of my Kentucky service, I put forth as much activity as was possible with the forces I had, to destroy or drive out of my district the guerrillas and Confederate recruiting men, and I received the repeated thanks of Governor Morton and my commanding officer, General Boyle, for what I accomplished. But I encountered considerable embarrassment in the exercise of my command. I was still Lieutenant Colonel of the 25th Indiana, then in General Grant's army on the lower Mississippi, and the troops sent into my district might be, and at times were, commanded by officers of higher rank than mine, and who accordingly to the Army regulations would displace me. It was the desire of both Morton and Boyle that I should continue in charge of the district, and they recognized that I deserved promotion. In a letter dated September 19, Governor Morton wrote me as follows, quote, "I desire to say frankly that it would be very gratifying to me to have you remain in command of the forces at and in the vicinity of Henderson, if, in justice to your own feelings and the interest of your own regiment, you could do so. The ability, energy, and sagacity you have thus far displayed is sufficient proof of your fitness for the command. But should you, on any account, feel embarrassed in your personal position, I cannot insist you shall remain, and as to this, I beg you will exercise your own discretion. It would afford me much pleasure to show my recognition of your gallant, efficient, and faithful services by promoting you to a colonelcy, and I should have done so before this, giving you one of the new regiments, had not orders from the War Department, a copy of which is herewith enclosed, prevented me from promoting officers connected with, quote, old regiments, unquote, to new commands. I regard you as entirely competent to lead a regiment, and your experience and uniform good conduct in the field, in my judgment, fairly entitle you to promotion. The orders alluded to have embarrassed me very much, but the Secretary of War has announced them as inflexible." End quote. When it became apparent that I would have to rejoin the 25th Indiana unless I was promoted, a way was found, how I do not know, whereby I was appointed colonel of the 65th Indiana Infantry, a new regiment which has just been organized at Evansville. The lieutenant colonel of the 65th was Thomas Johnson, my uncle, who 6 months before had been forced to resign on account of ill health. My promotion enabled me to continue in command of the district of western Kentucky continuously until our forces were transferred to another field in the following year. The action on my part during my command of the district of western Kentucky, which attracted the most attention and comment, was the enforcement of a money levy made upon the disloyal residents of Hopkins County to reimburse the Union citizens for loss sustained at the hands of the guerrillas. This action on my part was reported in full at the time to General Boyle and to Major General Wright, commanding the department, and was unreservedly approved by them. General Wright, in endorsing his approval, added, quote, "A few such expositions of zeal and energy would go far toward breaking up the lawless bands, which have been so long a terror in that quarter, and restoring peace and quiet in that section of Kentucky." End quote. Efforts were made in vain to the military commanders to have this levy revoked. Finally, Honorable L.W. Powell, one of the senators from Kentucky and a citizen of Henderson, after having failed with the War Department, visited President Lincoln in person, presented to him a list of the names of individuals assessed by me and the amount, and asked that in the exercise of his power as Commander-in-Chief of the Army, he disapprove of the levy and order the money returned. The request of Senator Powell, with his list, was sent by President Lincoln through the military channels calling for a report from me. I quote the following from my letter to General Boyle, dated February 16, 1863, in reply. Quote, I am in receipt of the letter of President Lincoln, with your endorsement thereon, instructing me to report on the names contained in the paper submitted by Senator Powell. You will remember that I made a full report of all my action in these matters at the time, giving in detail the condition of the country, the causes which led to my action, the amount levied, the manner in which it was distributed, and the effect which it has had upon the community. This report has been read by yourself and Major General Wright, commanding this department, and in all respects fully approved. I desire that this report be sent to the President. It was made upon my honor as an officer, and by it I desire that I may be judged. The money levied had been appropriated and paid out, as stated in my report, to the citizens of Hopkins County, who were the sufferers by the action of these very men and their friends who asked the President for redress. The money cannot now be refunded by them. I am the only person who should be held responsible, for if any wrong was committed, it was through the action taken by me as set forth in my report. I know that my action in the matter has had a most salutary effect upon the people, and Hopkins County is now enjoying a degree of peace and security which has not heretofore existed since the commencement of the rebellion. I trust my action may be approved by the President, as it has so flatteringly been done by yourself and Major General Wright. End quote. As I relied entirely upon my previous report to General Boyle for my vindication, I make some extracts from that document. Quote, for more than 3 months previous to this levy, I had been laboring as earnestly as the force under my command would permit in efforts to rid this part of Kentucky of the lawless bands of guerrillas. They had succeeded in breaking up the civil organization in all the counties lying between Green and Cumberland rivers, forcibly preventing the administration of the laws, stopping the mails, robbing peaceable citizens on the public highways, causing loyal men to flee from their families and homes, plundering them of horses, arms, goods, and anything of value that their comfort required or fancy demanded, interrupting the navigation of the rivers by firing into unarmed steamers, and were engaged in carrying on a warfare cowardly and cruel and entirely unwarranted by the rules of civilized nations. These bands of guerrillas were mounted on the best horses in the country. Stolen from the citizens, they were active and wily and thoroughly acquainted with the byways and hiding places, and were supported by vigilant friends on every side. I found it very difficult to drive them out, and one great obstacle to this was the fact that they were supported, encouraged, and harbored by the friends and sympathizers of the rebellion, who were enjoying this possession of their property and their homes under the protection of the government, while very many loyal citizens were driven from their families and their homes plundered by these armed robbers. The guerrillas possessed not a single tent and made no arrangements for a commissariat. Yet they never wanted for a friendly roof to shelter them and were bountifully supplied with cooked rations. Wherever they went, they were encouraged by hearty welcomes and approving smiles. They never could be surprised in their hiding places or overtaken in their flight because some sympathizers, enjoying the immunities of the government, would go before and warn them of our approach. I had exerted myself to drive out these bands and restore peace to these counties, and had only partially succeeded. I had time and again warned the secession sympathizers that if they continued to harbor, feed, and encourage these plunderers and assassins, I would be compelled to hold them responsible, that Union men, on account of their patriotic faithfulness to the government in this time of public distress, should not be driven from their homes, their property carried away, and their lives endangered without some compensation for their losses. They were daily making their complaints known to me, some loyal farmers having lost their last horse, not one being left to gather the corn or till the soil. Others had their stores or houses plundered. The secessionists were living in the peaceful enjoyment of their homes and the undisturbed possession of their property. The county of Hopkins was one of the strongholds of the guerrillas and their friends. They were numerous, active, and bold. After consulting with the most prominent Union men of the county as to the proper course to pursue, I organized the expedition, a partial report of which I gave you, in which I succeeded in scattering, capturing, or driving away all the organized bands in that county. Then, in order to give peace in future to that county, I determined to carry out the threat that I had so often made to the aiders and harborers of the guerrillas by holding them responsible for the depredations committed by their lawless friends. I accordingly made a money levy upon every prominent harborer or sympathizer of the guerrillas that I could reach, making the assessment against each individual in proportion to his property and support or countenance of the traitors. The amount so levied and collected has reached the sum of $13,335. This fund I have caused to be paid to an upright, loyal, and responsible citizen of Henderson, Kentucky. I have appointed a committee consisting of men of acknowledged probity, influence, and responsibility of Hopkins County, who are thoroughly acquainted with the people of the county. I have placed the matter entirely in the hands of citizens, removing it as far as possible from the control of the military. I have made it the duty of this committee to investigate the losses sustained by Union citizens of Hopkins County through the agency of the guerrilla bands, and to compensate them out of this fund in proportion to their necessities and losses." End quote. My report was forwarded through the War Department to President Lincoln, and approval of my action was made by the endorsement of the President in his own handwriting. Nothing further was heard through official channels of the levy. The town of Smithland at the mouth of the Cumberland River was in my district, and as it was an important depot for supplies for forces operating at and through Nashville, I was required to maintain a force there, and I was often called there in discharge of my duties. Under date of November 1, I received a letter from General Boyle enclosing 2 orders from Major General Wright, one placing under arrest and ordering a court-martial for the major commanding a detachment of a Wisconsin regiment stationed at Smithland, and the other ordering the detachment to be sent away to another army. It appears that the major enforced very little discipline, and that the troops were inflicting all kinds of outrages and terrorism on the residents. I was directed to take with me 1 or more companies of Indiana troops for a garrison. He added, quote, "I think, if practicable, you had better go down in person to Smithland. The citizens are apprehensive of an outbreak and great wrongs to them on finding that the Wisconsin troops are ordered off and the major placed under arrest. You will take prompt and decisive steps to prevent anything of the kind, even if you shall be under the necessity of using the musket or bayonet for that purpose. Exercise prudence, but firmness." End quote. I encountered no difficulty in executing my orders. The major quietly accepted his arrest, and disorderly troops were sent away, and the garrison of a portion of my 65th Regiment gave the citizens assurance of order. Some time after this visit I was again called down to Smithland, but for a very different reason. The emancipation of the slaves, brought about by President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, was greatly resented by many of the Union men of Kentucky. Upon the publication by President Lincoln of the notice of his intended action on September 22, 1862, quite a number of the officers of Kentucky regiments in the Federal Army resigned their commissions and returned home. Others, while remaining loyal to the government, deeply regretted the President's action, and General Boyle was among them. Large numbers of slaves escaping through the lines from Tennessee sought refuge within our encampments. In December, I received the following letter from General Boyle. Quote, "Do not allow Negro slaves to come into your lines. All such must be turned out and kept out. Have nothing to do with Negroes. Let them go. You will see that your command attend to this matter. I am anxious that Indiana troops especially have nothing to do with slaves." End quote. I sought to have this order observed by my command, distasteful as it was to many, and General Boyle commended me for my action, but called attention to the non-observance of the order, especially at Smithland, and asked me to give it my personal attention. I wrote my wife under date of January 25, 1863, quote, "I shall have to go down to Smithland again tomorrow. Considerable complaint is made about Major Butterfield on the Negro question. Governor Robinson of Kentucky complaining to General Boyle, and the General referring the matter to me. This eternal Negro question is a perfect nightmare to our loyal Kentucky patriots. We have to humor them amazingly. I try to act prudently, but I sometimes get vexed and disgusted." End quote. I have already noticed various occupations in which I have been engaged other than that of strictly military service. While in command of the District of Western Kentucky, I was ordered to go with a suitable force to the Cumberland River, midway between Smithland and Nashville, where the rebels had obstructed navigation by sinking barges loaded with stone in the channel. With vessels suited for the purpose, I spent 2 weeks in cleaning the channel for navigation. I sent my wife a Christmas greeting by telegraph from this point, reporting my success, and also that we had captured 30 guerrillas. During the greater part of my service in Kentucky, I had been much hampered by the lack of a sufficient force of cavalry to enable me to pursue and hunt down the guerrillas. After continued efforts in that direction, I received the following special order from General Boyle's headquarters. Quote, "Colonel John W. Foster is hereby authorized to mount the 65th Regiment Indiana Volunteers to be used as mounted infantry. The quartermasters and ordnance departments will furnish the necessary horses and horse equipments upon Colonel Foster's requisition." End quote. After my regiment was mounted and fully equipped, I had little trouble in clearing the county of guerrillas and giving peace to the Union citizens. I was greatly grieved in January 1863 to receive a letter from my wife telling me of my father's failing health. He had always been a devoted parent to his children, but he had doubly attached me to him at the opening of the war in patriotically encouraging his boys to enter the army, with the assurance that he would look after and care for their families. He wrote me frequent letters, and no day passed without a visit from him to my house to inquire for the health and needs of my wife and child. I wrote my wife, quote, "Your letter made me sad when I read of father's poor health. I wish I was at home to comfort him somewhat and to aid him in this business. You will do all you can to make his time pleasant. He thinks much of you. Visit him often, and let Alice go over and see him whenever he wants her or she wants to go, and teach her to be affectionate to him. These little acts of kindness will gratify him in his feeble health and declining years." End quote. My father's ill health continued after the date of this letter, but I was afforded the opportunity of visiting him several times and doing what I could to comfort him in his last days. On April 13th, 1863, he passed away. An account of the manner in which he met death is recorded in the, quote, Biography of Matthew Watson Foster, unquote, pages 81 to 83. Fortunately for the human race, our sorrows and our joys follow each other, often in quick succession. 2 weeks after the death of my father, while on an expedition into the interior of my district in pursuit of guerrillas, I received intelligence of the birth of our second child, Edith. She was our, quote, war baby, unquote, but she proved the harbinger of peace. Blessed with a sweet and even temper from her birth, she has spread peace and sunshine in her path through life. Although my field of military service was so near to my home, I did not cease to long for the time when I might return to my family. Writing to my wife on a Sabbath day, January 11, I say, "Oh, when will this terrible war be over, so that we may spend our Sabbaths together as we have in the past, so peacefully, so pleasantly, so profitably? It has always been one of my greatest privations in the army, that I was away from my family and Sabbath church enjoyments. God in his own time will give us peace, and return us to our Christian privileges and our home blessings. I can't help but wish I was at home, and wish it every day, and that circumstances were such that I might come with honor. I trust that time may come soon, but I do not want to dishonor all I have done by leaving at present. I want first to see the war looking toward its close." I wrote the following brief epistle to my wife in a jocose spirit. "For the love I bear you, I herewith enclose to you the fruits of my toil, danger, privations, and glory for the past 2 months, $381.65, according to the estimate of my services by the paymaster." I have referred to the embarrassment and trouble which came to me soon after I assumed command at Henderson by the condition of the state elections and the rebel civil officials. Another annual election occurred just before the close of my service in 1863, and I was required by General Boyle to see that his orders were enforced. In addition to the order that no one who was not in all things loyal to the state and federal governments should be allowed to be a candidate, A further order was issued which made it the duty of the judges of election to allow no one to vote unless he was known to them to be an undoubtedly loyal citizen, or unless he took the quote-unquote ironclad oath of loyalty prescribed by the state law. It was made the duty of the military authorities to see that these orders were enforced. I did not have a sufficient force to station a detachment at every voting place, but I scattered the military election proclamation broadcast and had a force at a number of the leading voting places. In one of the congressional districts within my command, I had a peculiar condition. The regular or state union candidate was opposed by a prominent citizen who had stood by the federal government at the beginning of the rebellion, had raised a federal regiment, and had fought gallantly at Donelson and Shiloh. But after the president's announcement of the Emancipation Proclamation, he resigned from the army and returned to Kentucky to array himself with the peaceful opponents of the administration. He was permitted to make a canvass of his district without any interference by the military, and at the election none of my command found it necessary to interpose. But the fact was that many who would have supported him at the polls abstained from voting because they were unwilling to take the quote-unquote ironclad oath. Although the state union candidate received a decided majority of the votes, his seat was contested by his opponent on the ground, among others, of military interference with the election, and my name was freely used in the debates, but the Union candidate was seated by Congress. In the course of the debate, the Union candidate, referring to the attacks upon me, said, quote, "Colonel Foster's services protected all that region of Kentucky, my home, the contestant's home, from rebel and guerrilla outrage and depredation. Without those services, the courts could not have been held, nor the laws administered in a large district of country." He afterwards led a brigade with brilliant success in East Tennessee, and the contestant will not forget that day on the banks of Green River when he and I waged a bloodless battle of words about politics in stone's throw of where Foster and his gallant Hoosiers stood in battle order, expecting John Morgan and his avalanche of cavalry. End quote. During my year's service in Kentucky, my command was frequently disturbed and put in battle array by reports from time to time that the rebel General Forrest or John Morgan was about to enter my district with a large force of cavalry. These reports were so frequent and unfounded that we became incredulous, but Morgan finally did come into Kentucky with quite a formidable force. General Boyle early notified me of his presence in the state, and that he might seek his way out by crossing Green River and passing through my district into Tennessee, and I was ordered to move my entire command to Green River, remove or destroy all the boats, and give him battle if he came my way. But Morgan had other schemes on hand. At noon, July 9, 1863, General Boyle telegraphed me that Morgan had crossed the Ohio River into Indiana some distance below Louisville with a cavalry force of 4,000 men. I was ordered to secure transports and put my command on board to move up the river. At 9 p.m., the same night, I received the following from Boyle. Quote, "Morgan may deflect west and try Evansville. I think he will move on New Albany. Gather your men, seize boats, and come up river. Send out scouts on Indiana side to learn of enemy's movement. Direct your movements accordingly. Attack and fight Morgan wherever he can be met." Unquote. About the same time, I had telegraphic advices from Governor Morton of Morgan's presence in Indiana, and that he was likely to move toward Evansville. When I received these orders and the information that Morgan had crossed the Ohio River into Indiana, in accordance with previous instructions, I was with my entire command on Green River, awaiting an expected attack from Morgan in that locality. I at once crossed Green River on the night of the 10th en route for the Ohio, but did not reach its banks until the night of the 11th, by which time Morgan was well on his way toward the state of Ohio. I was therefore not to share in the pursuit of this noted raider. I returned with my command to Henderson and redistributed them at various exposed places in my district. But this proved the end of my military operations in Kentucky. General Burnside had been ordered from the east to assume command of the Department of the Ohio, and was preparing the concentration of his forces for a movement for the relief of the loyal people of East Tennessee, and I felt sure my regiment would be included. Hence, I was not surprised to receive orders on the 7th of August, 1863, to move the 65th Indiana Mounted Infantry to Glasgow, from which place Burnside's movement was to begin. I was quite satisfied at this change. As early as February, I had made a visit to Louisville to ask General Boyle if he could not give me a more active service. The guerrilla warfare which I was carrying on was of a very unsatisfactory and unprofitable kind. My troubles with the disloyal citizens and the civil duties as to officials and the elections were not to my taste. As a soldier, I longed to be relieved from these unwelcome duties and to bear my share in the real military campaigns of the war. During my year's service in the district, I had received the warmest exhibitions of friendship from the Union citizens of Henderson and that region. Being stationed so near to my home, my wife often visited me, and these kind-hearted citizens always insisted on making her their guest. I received various testimonials of their esteem, among others a beautiful jeweled sword, sash, and belt. When it became known that my regiment was to be ordered away, an earnest petition was sent to General Boyle asking our retention, signed by all the Union citizens, headed by ex-Governor and ex-Senator Dixon. Honorable Thomas E. Bramlett, Governor of the state of Kentucky, wrote President Lincoln, asking that I might, quote, be retained in Western Kentucky in charge of the defenses of that section. I have recently passed all through Western Kentucky and find from personal observation the immense good which the vigilant and successful military guardianship of Colonel Foster has done for that section." Unquote. General Boyle, in a letter to the Secretary of War, said, quote, "I beg to say that Colonel J.W. Foster is one of my most vigilant, active, and useful officers in the volunteer army. He is a man of the first order of ability, with capacity to fill almost any place in the service, and no man known to me has done better service than Colonel Foster." End quote. In an editorial notice of some length, the Evansville Journal, in noticing the departure of the 65th Regiment, said, "While we are glad the gallant boys of this excellent regiment are about to be afforded an opportunity to engage in more active service, and to see some of the excitement of war on its grander scale, yet we cannot help regretting their departure from our vicinity. For a year past, the people along the border have felt that the 65th was a wall of safety, a mountain of rocks between them and the guerrillas. Colonel Foster, during his administration of affairs in the Green River region, has won not only the admiration of the friends, but also the respect of the enemies of the government." End of Chapter 6.
Chapter 7 of War Stories for My Grandchildren. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marianne Spiegel. War Stories for My Grandchildren by John Watson Foster. Chapter 7. The East Tennessee Campaign, Part 1. No portion of the people of our country had shown more devotion to the Union or suffered greater hardships on account of their loyalty during the Civil War than the citizens of East Tennessee. Almost the entire population of military age had fled over the mountains into Kentucky and enlisted in the Federal Army, and those who remained, the old men, the women, and the children, endured many privations and much persecution. It had long been the desire of the Federal Government to occupy East Tennessee with troops and free the loyal people from their oppression, and President Lincoln in 1863 determined that this relief should no longer be delayed. The army under General Burnside numbered approximately 20,000 men, a force which it was thought was sufficient for the purpose in view of the fact that General Rosecrans with a much larger army was moving from Middle Tennessee toward Chattanooga and northern Georgia. In a letter to my wife from Glasgow dated the 18th of August, I say, "We arrived here yesterday, found marching orders for this morning to go to Burkesville with our brigade. The brigade left this morning, but I got permission to stay over today to shoe horses and more fully equip the regiment. The indications are that the cavalry division will go to Knoxville after a few days' delay at Burkesville." From Ray's Crossroads I write on the 20th, "We reached here yesterday. How many days we will remain I do not know. We are anxious to move forward, wanting to get into East Tennessee as soon as possible. I drilled my regiment today, had a good dress parade, and made a very fine appearance. I think there is no regiment in the corps that will make a better show. It attracts very general attention. We are stopped here waiting for the supply trains to come up. If it were not for the stomachs of men and horses, an army could accomplish wonders. Kiss little Edith for me, and tell Alice her papa thinks of her very often and loves her very much." A letter the next day from the same place says, "We leave at 11 a.m., camp tonight at Marrowbone, tomorrow at Burkesville, thence to Albany and Jamestown, Tennessee. I am well and in good spirits. Do not be uneasy if you do not hear from me very soon again, as we shall probably draw in our couriers and close our line of communication tomorrow. The 23rd Army Corps has one cavalry division of the 3 brigades, each brigade consisting of 4 regiments and 1 battery, also 1 independent brigade of cavalry. The 2nd Brigade is the one in which is our regiment, and is commanded by Brigadier General Hobson. You see we have a very strong force of cavalry, with which we can overrun the whole of East Tennessee and a good part of North Carolina, if we can ever get through the gaps and over the mountains, and can manage to take along with us our supply of forage and rations. General Hobson is absent from the brigade sick. I am the senior colonel of the brigade, and in the absence of the general, I will be entitled to command. Before I arrived, Colonel Graham, 5th Indiana, was commanding, and as I had even more than I could well attend to, and as General Hobson was expected soon, I did not ask for the command, and will not do so unless I learn that General Hobson will not be able to join us soon. My regiment is the largest, and I think the best, in the brigade, having 850 fighting men with us." On August 28th I wrote, "We have been here in the vicinity of Jamestown for a few days. We are out of forage for our horses, and have to get green corn and what hay, straw, and oats we can find, feeding them also on wheat and rye. We are up on the top of the mountains, and the soil is very poor, the farms small, and there is little forage of any kind. Consequently, if we stay here much longer, we shall be driven to pretty close straits for our horses, and possibly for rations for ourselves. We are already short, and very little prospect of any soon, but as long as there is green corn the men will not starve. The route from Glasgow is very hilly and rugged, and we had great difficulty in getting our wagons over it. We are now up on the level of the mountains, where it is not so hilly. All the country is very poor, and the only good features about it are that it is healthy, has good water, and a goodly number of Union people. I will take command of the brigade today, as General Hobson is still sick at home. When we are so straitened for forage and rations, the responsibility is great and the task not a very desirable one." My next letter, dated September 2nd, gave an account of our occupation of Knoxville, the goal of our long march over the mountains. "Yesterday was the proudest day of my life. Sunday last, Generals Burnside and Curtis came up, and a juncture of the forces was formed at Montgomery. My brigade arrived at that place on Saturday in advance of all other. On Sunday afternoon General Burnside sent for me to report, and I received orders to move my brigade 5 miles to the front. This seemed to indicate that I would be permitted to keep the advance, and we were all well pleased. But about daylight the 1st Cavalry Brigade marched past us and out to the front on the Kingston Road, and we had no orders to move. At sunrise the 3rd Cavalry Brigade, General Shackelford, passed by and out to the front toward the reported enemy on the Kingston Road. I began to be impatient and somewhat disgusted. I waited for 2 hours more very anxiously, but no marching orders came. At 9 o'clock, Generals Burnside and Curtis, with their staffs and escorts, came up, and I thought then we were to go clear to the rear, but they halted at my headquarters, came in, and after examining the organization of my brigade, General Burnside had a private interview with me, in which he told me he wanted me to take my brigade on the Knoxville road and force Winter's Gap, which would flank the enemy on the right and compel them to fall back, when, if matters went on smoothly, he would give me orders to push right on to Knoxville. Nothing could have suited me better. I would rather then have had those orders than to have received the commission of a general. So at 11 o'clock I formed my brigade, and leaving every one of our wagons behind, marched to Winter's Gap, arriving there at sundown and occupied it, finding that the enemy had fled in the morning. I reported promptly to General Burnside, and about 4 o'clock yesterday morning I received orders to push on to Knoxville and occupy the town, attacking any force of rebels which might be there. We were in motion within an hour, and all along the road, as everywhere heretofore in our march through East Tennessee, we were received with the warmest expressions and demonstrations of joy. In the morning I expected that I would not be able to take the town without a fight, but as my brigade had been assigned to the post of honor, I was satisfied it would do its full duty. A few miles before we reached the town, we ascertained that the rebels had all left, the last of them that morning. The 5th Tennessee Cavalry, which was in the advance, surrounded the town, and about 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon I rode into town with the staff and escort, and such an ovation as we received was never before during this war given to an army. The demonstration beggars all description. Men, women, and children rushed to the streets. No camp meeting shouting ever exceeded the rejoicing of the women. They ran out into the street shouting, "Glory, glory, the Lord be praised, our Saviour's come," and all such exclamations. The men huzzaed and yelled like madmen. In their profusion of greetings, I was almost pulled from my horse. Flags long concealed were brought out from their hiding places. As soon as I could get to a hotel, I was waited upon by the mayor, a true Union man, and a large number of loyal men, prominent citizens, and they received me with heartiest congratulations and welcome. All afternoon and into the night, until the provost guard sent all citizens to their homes, the streets resounded with yells and cheers for the Union and Lincoln. A marked feature of the loyalty of this section, so very different from Western Kentucky, is that the people have no scruples about hurrahing for Lincoln. They recognize him as the leader and head of government. It is stated that last night, after the occupation of the town, the intelligence was communicated to the people throughout the country by the firing of guns from place to place and by signal fires on the mountains. And this morning the streets were crowded with people from the country far and near, and such rejoicing I never saw before. How they shouted and stood with uncovered heads beneath the old stars and stripes. With what sincere welcome they met the soldiers. The mayor of the city brought forth an immense flag, which he had kept, waiting anxiously for the day when he could unfurl it. This was suspended early this morning over Main, or Gay Street, and at the sight of it, the people as they came in from the country yelled with a perfect frenzy of delight. Early in the day a procession of ladies was formed, and bearing 2 American flags, they marched down Main Street under the large flag in order that they might fulfill a vow they made early in the war, that they would in a body march under the first American flag raised in Knoxville. It does soldiers good to fight for such a people. It is a labor of love. Every soldier in my brigade has been paid 100 times over since we came into East Tennessee for all our hardships, short rations and exposures, by the hearty welcome of the people. We can see upon their faces the recognition of the fact that we have delivered them from a cruel bondage. Although the rebels have for 5 days been removing their property, we came upon the town so suddenly yesterday that we captured a large amount of army property, 5 locomotives, a number of cars, and saved the mills, foundry, railroad works, hospitals, and other army buildings from burning. September 3rd. I went yesterday to visit the prison where the rebels kept the Union men confined. It is a dirty, filthy jail, hardly fit for the lowest criminals. I saw the room in which Parson Brownlow was confined. On the wall of it, in large black letters, is written, "Death to our persecutors." When we came in on Tuesday, the gallows was standing near the railroad, at the edge of the town, where the Union men were dragged from the jail and, contrary to all law and civilized warfare, hung like felons for faithlessness to their government. You will find something of this in Brownlow's narrative. I rode over to see it as soon as I could on the morning after we arrived, and to place a guard over it, but some enraged soldiers and citizens had gone there before me and cut it down and burned it. I was sorry, because it was in a prominent place and I wanted to preserve it as a monument of the wickedness and cruelty of the persecutors of these people. We had this morning a fresh outbreak of patriotism. The news of the federal occupation of the town had by last night spread into the adjoining counties, and the people flocked in from every direction. A large delegation of men and women of all ages formed in long procession from Sevier County, and carrying the American flag, paraded through the town and out to camp, and the town again ran wild with patriotic joy. Men who had been hiding among the rocks and caves of the mountains, who had not seen each other for years or since the rebellion broke out, stood grasping each other's hands beneath the folds of the old flag, while tears streamed down their cheeks. I have read of tears of joy, but never saw so much of it as here. But General Burnside and the rest of the army will be in town this evening, and I must get ready to receive them. So goodbye for the present. In my letter of the 7th, I gave an account of my first expedition out of Knoxville. A day or two after his arrival, General Burnside sent for me to say that he had received information which he thought was reliable, to the effect that the rebels had left the railroad up as far as Bristol on the Virginia line, 130 miles, in good condition and unguarded, that at Bristol there was a roundhouse and a good supply of locomotives and cars, and that it was very desirable to get possession of this rolling stock if possible. He proposed that I should make up a train out of the rolling stock I had captured on my occupation of Knoxville, and go up the railroad as far as I could do so safely, and reach Bristol if possible. It was a new business for me to go a-soldiering on a railroad train, but I cheerfully undertook the expedition. I had to secure the engineer and brakeman out of my own command, as there were none others available. Putting 3 of the companies of the 65th dismounted on the train, we started out early in the afternoon, hoping to get over a good part of the road before dark, but within 10 miles of Knoxville we encountered a small burnt bridge. But the tools we had brought with us and some of our expert railroad men were able to arrange a temporary crossing for the train. It was nearly dark when we reached Strawberry Plains, only 17 miles out, and here we stopped the train. As I had learned that the president of the railroad lived here, and he would probably be at home, as he had fled from Knoxville before our arrival. I took a small guard with me to his house, where I found him. I explained that our general had sent me on an expedition up his road toward the Virginia line, and as we had no one on the train who was familiar with the road, I should esteem it a great favor if he would accompany us. Seeing the situation with my armed guard, he accepted the invitation with the best grace possible. But as we moved off, the ladies of the household set up a fearful wailing, beseeching me not to take him, as they felt sure he was going to his death. Notwithstanding, I assured them that no harm should come to him. After comfortably seating the president, I took the post with the brigade bugler on top of a pile of wood on the locomotive tender, and the train moved off at slow speed in the darkness on the strange road, without a stop until we reached Jonesboro, 98 miles from Knoxville, after midnight. Here our engineer, not being familiar with the switches, ran the 4 wheels of his locomotive off the track. While a few of us dismounted to aid in getting it on the track again, I discovered that another train was lying on the track with a lot of invalid Confederate soldiers, who told us the train had just arrived that evening from Richmond. About the same time we heard a great commotion in the town, with loud military commands indicating the presence of troops. It was very dark, and we were strange to the locality, but I ordered out a platoon of soldiers, who fired a volley or 2 in the direction of the noise, which was followed by a great clatter of horses' hoofs. The next day, as we came back, the citizens told us that the rebel troopers could be seen in all directions flying away, some bareback, others without firearms or hats. It proved to be a detachment of Confederate cavalry stationed in the town. At Jonesboro we learned from the station employees that another train would be due from Richmond about 8 o'clock in the morning. 13 miles above that place the railroad crossed the Watauga River, where there was a rebel blockhouse or fort protected by artillery, and which we learned was garrisoned. Our only hope of getting to Bristol was to capture the incoming train and rush our own train unawares into the fort and take the garrison by surprise. So after leaving a guard in charge of the train found at Jonesboro, we moved up quietly about daybreak to the first station this side of the fort, surrounded the town with orders to allow no one to pass out, and we lay quietly in ambush waiting for the train. Sure enough, it came along on time, and we were greatly elated. But just before it got within gunshot of our ambush, it whistled down the brakes, stopped, and instantly ran backwards at full speed, and whistling into the fort. Someone had given them a warning signal, and the fort was at once notified of our presence. With that our expedition to Bristol came to an end. General Burnside had been misinformed. The railroad above Knoxville was not only guarded, but was in use from Richmond. Our return journey was uneventful, except that, as we neared Jonesboro, some of the soldiers we had scattered had quite dexterously loosened a rail and slightly displaced one end at a sharp curve in the road on a downgrade, which tumbled our locomotive down an embankment and disabled it. Several of the soldiers were bruised, and the railroad president got a few slight scratches on his face. Fortunately, we had the captured locomotive, and with it we took all the cars back to Knoxville. Our return was on Sunday, and as the news of our passing up in the night had got noised about, the whole country turned out in gala dress and with flags to welcome us. My next letter is from Greenville, 74 miles above Knoxville, on the railroad, the home of Andrew Johnson, afterwards President of the United States. It is dated September 12th. I have my brigade at this place, as also the 103rd Ohio Infantry assigned to my command, and stationed here as a provost guard. Generals Burnside and Hartsuff, Corps Commander, have been very pleasant and kind, and are disposed to do everything they can for me. They promised to send me on an expedition by way of Bristol into Virginia to destroy the salt works, probably the most important movement left in East Tennessee, I am in very good health and spirits. We were still at Greenville on September 16th. My chief trouble seemed to be with the mails. I had not heard from home for nearly a month. I write to my wife. It has been so long since I have heard from you. How I would appreciate a letter today from my dear wife, telling me about our family affairs, that she is well, that our dear little children were well, giving me some of the sayings and doings of my little Alice, to have some news from Evansville and the families there. If it had not been that I had so very much to do, and such great responsibilities resting upon me that kept me actively employed, I should have been lonely indeed. When I go a-soldiering again, I want it along the river or railroad, so I can get some communication with the outer world and my wife. I am glad to assure you that in this long interval of suspense, I have been in good health, and I think discharging my duties to the entire satisfaction of my superior officers. I am very well satisfied at being ordered away from Henderson and placed in active service. It has given me a very prominent and choice command, and brought me in close contact with the commanding generals of the army. During the past 3 weeks I have been in close and intimate relationship with General Burnside and Hartsuff, and acting directly under their orders. We have been for a week at this place in front of an army of rebels at Jonesboro, 20 miles above here, momentarily expecting an attack. I think that within a few days we will make a movement that will completely drive them out of Tennessee. If so, you may expect to hear of the 2nd Brigade dashing away up onto the sacred soil of Virginia. I have a very good brigade of near 3,000 effective men. For the present I am holding this position with my brigade and 2 regiments of infantry till General Burnside comes up with the army which is on its way. Several times a day I am called to the telegraph office for conversations over the wire with General Burnside on the situation at the front, and he freely calls for my views as to movements. He is a very kind-hearted and pleasant gentleman, and willing to give every officer his full share of credit. I write thus freely to my wife of these matters because she will be interested to know them, and to her it will not appear boasting or self-praise. I wish I had time to prepare a letter for the friends at home on the state of affairs in East Tennessee, and give a simple narrative of the facts as to what the Union men have suffered. Such cruelty, such oppression, and heartless wrong has no parallel, at least on this continent. It may have been equaled by the barbarians of Europe. No wonder that the people receive us with tears and perfect ecstasy of rejoicing and unbounded enthusiasm. The rejoicing and demonstrations I have witnessed will be probably the brightest of my reminiscences of the war. No wonder these people have wept tears of joy at the sight of the old flag, for it has brought to them freedom from a tyrannical oppression. It was the highest epoch of my life to first carry that flag into Knoxville, and to bear it in the advance corps up along this valley for more than 100 miles, and receive the welcome of the loyal people. And I hope in a few days to have the honor to say that we have driven the enemy entirely beyond the borders of the state. At our advance men have come to us all bleached and weak, who have been hiding in the rocks and caves and in pits away from the light of day for months. Men have been chased through the mountains for conscription in the rebel service, and a bounty offered for their arrest or death. Women have been driven from their homes, and their houses and their all were burnt before them because their husbands were in the Union army. The scaffolds were to be seen where loyal men were hung for suspicion of bridge burning without any trial whatever. The tales of cruelty and wrong which I have heard go to make up a history of tyranny which will be the blackest record of this slaveholders' rebellion. There is a valley over the line in North Carolina, about 25 miles from this place, just under the shadow of the Great Smoky Mountains, almost shut out from the world. The valley along the creek is rich and inhabited by a bold but simple race of men. These men, partaking of the true spirit of the mountains, were true and unalterably attached to the government, and no bribes or threats could induce them to go into the Southern army. There was but a small community of them, and they were unanimous. When the conscripting officers came to take them into the army by force, and the foragers to carry off their horses and provisions, they met them along the mountainsides with their squirrel rifles and drove them back. It was almost worth a Confederate officer's life to venture into the valley. Finally they sent a large force of cavalry and Indians among them and drove the mountaineers before them. They fled to their hiding places, and none of the men fit for military duty could be found. The cavalry gathered up all their horses and cattle. The women and children, old men and boys, were left at home, thinking them safe from conscription. The savage traitors drove the families from their houses and burnt them and everything in them. But this was not all. The old men, the women, and children were driven out of the valley and made to walk on foot over the mountains and down to Greenville. Old and prominent citizens of this place have told me that it was the most pitiable sight they ever beheld. A stout-hearted and manly citizen, in talking about it to me, could not restrain the tears, saying that he never related the circumstances without tears, because it brought the sight so vividly before him. Women came carrying children in their arms, with other little ones barefooted and almost naked clinging to their skirts. There were women of all ages and children driven like sheep before the soldiers. There were women in a most delicate situation, who were made to walk with the rest. If the suffering were the greater, the punishment was the more appropriate. They were brought to the railway station and kept overnight, and it was the determination of General, called Mudwall, in contradistinction to the Stonewall, Jackson, in command here, to send them over the Cumberland Mountains to Kentucky. Governor Vance of North Carolina heard of the brutal proceeding in time, and declared that the women and children should not be banished from his state so long as he was governor, and they were ordered to be returned. Since then these men of the Laurel Valley have been the wild men of the mountains. Their homes have been in the caves and cliffs of the rocks, and woe to the rebel soldier who came within range of their rifles. The most vigorous measures have been taken to ferret them out, but few of them have ever been caught. Their hiding places and their daring were a good protection. A company of them twice attempted to break through and cross the Cumberland Mountains to join the Union Army in Kentucky, but they were driven back before they could get out of East Tennessee. Day before yesterday, a company of over 50 of these brave men came over from the mountains and asked me for help. An old man, who was the spokesman and the wise man of the valley, said they were a poor, ignorant, wild set of cusses who don't know much but devotion to the flag of their country and how to shoot. He asked me to give them a little good advice and some guns. I could not refuse the latter, at least. I gave them the arms and sent them home, and a merciful God will have to protect the savages who have murdered their fathers, plundered their farms, burnt their houses, and driven their wives and mothers from their homes, for these men with their muskets will not remember mercy. This is no fancy sketch or exaggerated story of the war. It is the plain, unvarnished truth, to be vouched for by hundreds of citizens of Greenville. Could you have believed that such atrocity could have been committed in the land of Washington? This same General Jackson is now in front of us, and I have been asking General Burnside for days to let my brigade after him, but he withholds for the present. It will not be many days before I shall try to capture him or drive him out of East Tennessee, I hope forever. The expedition from which I had so greatly longed to drive out the rebel General Jackson, and which General Burnside had promised, did not come off. General Rosecrans had suffered a severe repulse at Chickamauga, and Burnside was ordered to give him what support he could. This brought all of Burnside's plans above Knoxville to a dead halt. Bragg's rebel cavalry was reported to have crossed the Tennessee River and was threatening Rosecrans' rear, and all of Burnside's cavalry was ordered to follow up Bragg's movement. My next letter was written at Knoxville, October 1st, to which place I had come with my brigade. On arrival here, I was still without letters from home. I had attempted to telegraph, but could get no replies. Apparently my disconsolate condition had worked upon General Burnside's sympathy, and he sent a telegram in his own name inquiring about the whereabouts and health of my wife, which soon brought an answer that she was at Evansville and all well. How this news was received is told in the letter. You can hardly imagine how gratifying it is to me to know tonight that my dear wife and children are well, from whom I am so far separated. I can go tomorrow to execute the orders of the general with much more alacrity that I now know that you are well and at home. Aside from its inaccessibility for the mails, I find East Tennessee a very pleasant country to be in. The Union people are very kind and friendly, the climate is very healthy, and the valley of East Tennessee one of the most beautiful in America. I tell the people here that if we can get peace again and they will abolish slavery, I would like very much to come and live with them. I have been very kindly and considerately treated by them. Being in the advance all the time, I have been the first to make their acquaintance, and they consequently know me better than the others. I need not live in camp at all while about Knoxville. I have been here now 4 days, and have had only one meal in camp. The society of the Union people of Knoxville is very pleasant and quite cultivated. But my visits to Knoxville are only pleasant episodes in my military life. Cavalry must be active. I am off again. The brigade left tonight for Loudon, starting at dark in a pitiless rain, and it has been raining ever since. General Burnside had me wait over here tonight that he might confer with General Shackelford and me as to my movements, and he will give me a special train in the morning for myself and staff. He has invited me to come in the morning and take breakfast with him, when the matter will be definitely settled and I will be off. Bragg's cavalry has crossed over to the north side of Tennessee River, threatening Rosecrans' rear and communications, and we must do something to checkmate them if possible. I have a good brigade, and the general is disposed to give me work to do. General Shackelford commands our division now, and is very kind and partial to me. My next letter was written from Knoxville, October 4th. I wrote you 3 nights ago. Then my brigade had been ordered to Loudon, and I was only remaining behind to get the last and special instructions of the general before going myself, expecting to be off in the morning. But I am still here, and my brigade at Loudon. Every few hours I have been expecting definite orders, and something transpires to prevent it. During the last few days I have been getting a pretty good insight into the inner workings of our military affairs. I have been in General Burnside's private room daily and frequently, in conference with him and other generals, and know something about the interference of Washington City. The plans were all laid, my guides were selected, the rations all issued, my brigade was ready and waiting, and in a short time I was to be off on a grand raid into Georgia in rear of Bragg's army, tear up the railroad system of that state, and alarm the rebels generally, when orders were received from General Halleck that raids into Georgia are not now contemplated, and all that is stopped. Probably you will thank General Halleck for that. It may have made me a general. It may have run me into Libby Prison, but it was a great disappointment to me, and I think to the general. I have seen more of General Burnside than any of our generals, and regard him as one of the best of men, a pure patriot, a just man, and I hope a Christian. Let me give you an instance. Yesterday evening everything was ready for a general movement of his whole army. I telegraphed my brigade at Loudon to be ready to move at 2 o'clock this morning. The forces at Cumberland Gap were notified to be in readiness. It appeared a matter of importance that we should be off. I went up to his room last night to get my final instructions. The general said he believed we would wait a day, as he forgot about tomorrow being Sunday. He said he always felt a disinclination to commence a movement on Sunday, and he would not do it unless he should learn during the night that it was very urgent. So today we have a quiet Sabbath, the only one since we left Kentucky. It was very pleasant to me and doubtless to the whole army. It turned out that Bragg's cavalry was not a severe menace to Rosecrans, and my brigade was recalled from Loudon, and we moved up into Virginia as a part of the general movement just indicated. In a fight near Bristol, the 65th Regiment lost 4 killed and 13 wounded, and had another fight at Jonesboro, from which place the letter of October 18th is written. We have just returned from a fatiguing march into Virginia. We have succeeded in driving the enemy away from Zollicoffer, having another fight at Bloutsville, and destroying the Virginia Railroad for 10 miles, but I have no time to write about it. I have stood in the last 2 weeks' campaign remarkably well, and continued in the best of health. I enjoy the cavalry service very much, only lately we have had a little too much of a good thing. During the past 5 weeks we have been continuously on the march, with a number of sharp fights, but we have now a prospect of a few days' rest. If I get it, I will improve it to write you a good long letter, but the enemy may interfere with my plans any day. This is likely to be our outpost station until Rosecrans and Bragg settle affairs below. How often and how much I desire to be at home with the dear ones and families of relations and friends. As we rode along through the mud and rain today, I thought of home and what a pleasure it would be for me to be with you all at home. But I must content myself, believing I am in the line of duty, and pray that a kind Providence may bring me home at an early day. I have always believed that God is doing His will and accomplishing His purpose of right and freedom in this war, and if I can be one of the instruments in His hands of accomplishing a portion of this work, we should be content. Kisses in abundance to my darling little children. Does my little Alice talk much about her papa? Tell her he thinks all the time about her. End of Chapter 7, Part 1.